Helen Cook, thanks so much for coming to Titans of Nuclear today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm a really avid listener to your podcast, and you and Brad have interviewed before a lot of my friends and colleagues, so it's really nice to chat with you.
Yeah, well, we're happy to have you. We're happy to add you to the Titans list.
Thank you.
You were recommended by a Titan.
Yes.
So we were really excited to talk to you because we love how close-knit the nuclear community is. It's really interesting to have a podcast that's like a friend group where everyone knows all the different
exactly.
Titans.
I'm always scrolling down trying to find like, who do I know? Oh, I know that person. I'm going to listen to that. So yeah, cool. It's really nice.
And so right now you're a principal at Global Nuclear Energy Advisory.
That's right.
And before we get into sort of your work and what you do, I want to talk a little bit about your background. So you're from Australia, which is a no nuclear country. You guys actually have laws banning nuclear?
Yes, that's right.
So how in the world did you end up in the nuclear industry?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Naomi. So let's see, I grew up in Sydney, Australia, and I did my law degree at Sydney University. And after university, I guess I kind of did what a lot of Aussies do, which is put a backpack on my back and go backpacking through Europe for 6 months.
We were just talking about that, how Australians love to travel.
Yeah, we really do. We really do. And we're so far away from the rest of the world that when we go, we often go for quite a while. So, and I've now been out of the country for 12 years. So I guess that's quite a while. But anyway, so I went overseas and I was backpacking and I got a call that I'd been accepted to do an internship at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which is based in The Hague in Holland. And so I thought, I'll just push back my start date in corporate law just a little bit more and I'll just go and do this. So I did that for 3 months. It was really interesting. And during that 3 months, I got a call from the President's office at the International Criminal Court asking whether I would be interested in interviewing for a position with the president as the intern to the president of the ICC. It was actually the first president of the ICC, Judge Felipe Kirsch. And so I thought, 6 more months, but yes, okay, I'm going to do this. This is too good an opportunity to pass.
How does that land in your lap? I mean, do you know people? Are you like on LinkedIn?
No. I mean, this is back in the day where the social media stuff wasn't really, and social networks weren't really a big thing. So I applied online. And just got an email. I actually got the email about the ICTY internship while I was in an internet cafe in Morocco, trying to get the Wi-Fi to work. And anyway, I ended up spending 9 months in Holland, which was awesome and got me interested even more in international law and international work. But I did return to Australia and I started my job in corporate law and had a beautiful, beautiful office looking down Sydney Harbour, just lovely. And I got a call one day about a year into practicing to say, are you interested in working overseas? And I said, well, yes, I really am interested in working overseas, but you know what? I'm a really baby lawyer, not right now. Let's think about, call me back in a year or maybe 2.
Why not just take the jump and be like, if you think I'm good enough, I'm good enough?
Well, I did. Look, I said, if the right opportunity came my way, feel free to send it. I just don't think anyone will hire me because I'm too junior. That was what was going on in my head. And he said, well, where are you interested in? And I said, well, not London, because all Aussies go to London, not New York, because that's their next choice. So I said, well, I've heard about a place called Dubai. What about that? Is anyone looking for lawyers in Dubai? And anyway, within a week, I had a job description in my inbox, and it was for the right law firm, a major international law firm, and it was in Dubai. And 4 weeks later, I rocked up in the height of summer to a place I had never been to join the Dubai office of a firm called Freshfields Brucker Steringer. So I was there for 4 years, and it was actually during those 4 years that I got into nuclear. I guess looking back, I can actually remember the exact day because growing up in Australia, I'd certainly never heard of nuclear energy. It just wasn't part of our conversation growing up. I knew we had something related to nuclear somewhere in Sydney. We have a research reactor in Sydney, but nuclear energy, just no. And certainly you couldn't study nuclear law at university. So I had literally never heard of this thing, nuclear law, as applied to civil use of nuclear energy. Anyway, I was in my office in Dubai one day, and the managing partner, who was my boss for all Freshfield's Middle Eastern practice, came into the office and he said, "Oh, Helen, what are you doing tomorrow?" And I said, "I don't know, Joe, what am I doing tomorrow?" And he said, "Well, I've just received a call from the Deputy Prime Minister of Bahrain asking me to go over for a meeting. I don't know what it's about. He didn't tell me what it was about, but, do you want to come with me? We haven't been to Bahrain together in a while." So I said, "Yep, okay, fine." So over we went the next day, flew over, and we were waiting for the meeting to start in this quite enormous meeting room. And one by one, in walked the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Defence, the Minister of Trade, the Minister of Electricity and Water, Oil and Gas, etc. And then finally the Deputy Prime Minister. And he said, "Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to Bahrain's first meeting of the newly formed National Committee for Nuclear Energy. All of our neighbours are considering nuclear power as an option, and we want to consider it as well. And Joe, we'd like Freshfields to advise us."
Amazing.
And so I just was lucky enough to be at the right place at the right time, to be in a meeting about a subject I knew nothing about, and then have the opportunity over the next few years to kind of learn all about nuclear energy as we advise the government of Bahrain on how to develop their program. And they weren't even a member of the IAEA at the time, so they had to, do that, and then they had to think about the treaties and conventions that they might sign up to and draft a national law, which I was able to do, and blah, blah, blah. So it was a really, really interesting work, and a really fun way to get into nuclear energy when you knew nothing about it from the start.
Yeah, that's an amazing way. And I think here at Titans of Nuclear, none of us come from a strictly nuclear background.
Right.
And so we tried to learn from scratch as well by talking to the experts and learning from what people have done. So it's really interesting to see how your start also came from a non-nuclear background, because I think in some ways it's almost a benefit.
Yeah.
To not have this predisposition of what laws are like in other countries, and having worked with it before. So you mentioned, drafting some laws for them. So how did you even start to, go through, I guess, the literature on what was being done?
Yeah. Well, I looked around the world and I thought, okay, so which are the countries that have nuclear energy, and which are the ones that have had it for a long time and have an established system of laws? Because you need some inspiration, right? You never pick up a page from scratch and just start drafting. You get inspired, and there's precedent, and you look at things that you can use as a basis. And so looking around the world, the regulatory systems are quite different in different established nuclear countries. The philosophies of regulation are different, for example, between the UK and the US. And being an Aussie lawyer, there was a movement as I was going through university, and certainly when I started practicing, that was all about plain English, plain language, drafting laws as well as contracts in simple terms that are easy to understand. And I hate to say it, but when I had a look at the laws of the US and, all of the regulations for the NRC for the first time, I thought, whoa, that's really complicated. Yeah. And I don't quite understand all of this, and I'm sure I could take the time to learn. And, I'm now a US qualified lawyer, but I was looking for a regime that was a little bit more straightforward, a little bit more easy to understand, that would make an interesting basis upon which to start drafting a regime for Bahrain. Right. And the one that was of most interest to me was actually, or that felt like the right fit, was actually the Canadian system. So I had a look at Canada's national law and took some inspiration from it. Now, of course, there's also IAEA publications, which are very useful. There's actually, when I was drafting the law, there was the handbook on nuclear law produced by the Office of Legal Affairs of the IAEA, which is an excellent document. But at the time when I was drafting this law, they hadn't yet released their implementing legislation. And their implementing legislation is actually a document which does what it says. It actually has provisions that countries can use as a basis and a starting point for their nuclear laws. But that document hadn't been published yet.
Do you know why? Why wasn't it published?
They were just working on it.
Oh, they were?
Yeah. So there are a lot of countries at the time that were thinking about nuclear, and they were coming to the IAEA and saying, can you review the laws we've drafted, or can you help us draft them? And so the IAEA thought it should produce a document that did exactly that. And so it was actually quite funny because we had just submitted the first draft of this law that I'd worked on for a number of months trying to draft it for Bahrain. We just submitted it to the Bahrainis, to the Ministry of Justice for review. And I went to the IAEA with my then boss at the time, and we met with the head of legal at that point, Johan Rottenbach, and he handed me a copy of the implementing legislation that had, was hot off the press. It had just been published. And it was like I just received the answers to some exam that I had been sitting for 3 months. And so, of course, I had to go back and double check all my work against the IAEA's implementing legislation. So,
and did it match up? Did you guys kind of come to similar conclusions?
You know what, we did. And I then used that, actually, that experience as a chapter in the book that I've written on the subject, because there were some things that, yes, they had done a little bit differently, and there were some things that I'd thought about and just taken a bit further, which really is the idea of the IAEA publications. They're an excellent starting point, but countries need to take them home and think about how to implement them in their own regimes and make them fit for purpose and fit for their programs. So, I'd done some of that thinking for Bahrain and already taken that legislation a little bit further in some ways.
And when you're doing all this work, first of all, did it really only take 3 months for you to get a first draft out?
Yeah, I think maybe it took a bit longer, but yeah, these things are never
years.
Well, when you've got good precedents out there, and the Canadian legislation was good, and when you know the basic structure of what it should be, which I knew, it's then a matter of how detailed that law needs to be. And nuclear framework laws, so the main piece of national legislation, can actually be quite high level, because it's the regulations that implement the provisions of the law. That's where you start to get the detail.
And the regulations are on a country level versus on an international, or both?
So the law is on a country level. The national law is the country's main framework law. And then, yes, it will normally establish a nuclear regulator and empower the nuclear regulator to promulgate regulations, which is all of those detailed things on design and construction and siting and all that stuff, which you need if you want to actually construct a nuclear power plant in your country.
And when you were making sort of this framework and the first sort of draft of the regulations, you didn't do the regulations.
We didn't get to the regulations,
but you kind of have to plan for it in mind in some ways, I'm assuming. What were some of the limiting factors of nuclear? Some places where when you're drafting the framework that you're like, nuclear is kind of risky in this area, or it's challenging to make regulations around in this area.
I mean, there's a few different things, I guess, to think about. And I think an issue that countries today will be grappling with, which we weren't thinking at the time when we were drafting Bahrain's law, is technology. And are we going to go big, or are we going to go small? And what do you need to think about when, we have frameworks and regulatory frameworks that are established and they're drafted for large-scale reactors. We don't have that yet for small modular reactors. And the question is, for newcomer countries, what do they do when they're trying to set up their laws and regulatory regimes to prepare for potential SMRs, for example? So that's something that I think is on the minds of developing countries today that are looking at setting up all that legal and regulatory infrastructure. But there are other issues that need to be considered too, like nuclear liability.
Yeah.
That if you look down the list of treaties and conventions that countries will sign up to as they're developing their programs, it's often the nuclear liability ones that are left until the end, because they're very complicated. It's not straightforward to implement them. They fundamentally change liability rules in the country pertaining only to third-party liability for nuclear damage, so a very specific set of circumstances and legal issues. But still, it's a big thing to implement a fundamental change like that into your national regime. And so that's an area that is often left till last because it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard.
So to start on the first area, when you say that, you have to have sort of this different framework and this different perspective for countries that want SMRs instead of large-scale reactors, what about the regulations make them specific to large reactors? Why can't you just scale down the regulations?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that is what we are trying to figure out as an industry and as regulatory bodies today. And I'm not sure we have the answer yet. And one of the problems of talking about SMRs, of course, is that there are so many different designs and so many different technologies, and some of them are evolutionary in that they are scaled down large light water reactors, and then some are quite different. And it's very hard when you're looking at developing a legal framework, and more specifically the regulatory regime. That's where the difference between technologies starts to be a consideration. But it's very hard to talk generically about that, and countries need to start thinking about it. And as an industry, we need to get out in front of some of these issues of, okay, so this SMR goes under the ground. What does that mean from a licensing perspective? What are the extra things we need to think about? Are the existing regulations that we have anywhere in the world set up for a unit that is below ground level? Maybe, maybe not.
Right.
What about modular construction, where you have, and that's one of what we say of the potential benefits of SMRs, it's even in the title, small modular nuclear reactors, that they can be factory built as fully fabricated modules and then shipped to a different country for deployment. Okay, so how do we monitor then the construction essentially that's going on in a different country, as well as the transportation of that module all the way over to the site? So SMRs throw up, multiple different issues for consideration. They're going to be deployed on the seabed. Floating SMRs, which we already have one in Russia. They raise a lot of different issues that we need to start thinking about.
Yeah.
And we are thinking about them. I shouldn't say start thinking about them. We are thinking about them. But I guess the perspective I come from is that I do a lot of work with countries that are newcomers to nuclear and thinking about this for the first time, not the established market that has the regulatory regime and might need to tailor it for SMRs. I'm thinking of the one that is putting this in place for the first time. And how do they do that? What do they do? Where do they look? And today I don't think we have the answers for the next wave of technology.
So do you feel like you want to focus on those newcomer countries because of your start in nuclear, starting from or because you believe in the SMR technology over just building our traditional reactors?
No, I mean, I would like to see more large-scale reactors built around the world. That's what I would like to see, and that's what we've just started to get these Gen 3 plus units maybe to operations, or we're heading there for some of them now. I would like to see those lessons learned deployed in more projects with large reactors. That I think we need. But I hear it being discussed in industry that maybe the time for large reactors is over, and actually the future of nuclear is small reactors. So, I express a personal preference for, I think we should build more large reactors because I think we have a climate issue and I think large reactors can contribute to that. I think we need to be focused on, if we are going to deploy SMRs, as we say we are, and there are some pretty advanced projects out there, then we need to get out in front and make sure that when we do, we know what the licensing regime is. We can essentially get those regulations and get that regulatory regime in whatever country you want to deploy it to, have the human resources that can actually do the licensing.
Right.
And that's what we need to be thinking about if we want to be able to successfully, on time, on budget, deploy the new technologies.
But so if you do feel like have a preference towards the large scale reactors, why not just go in, and say, okay, NRC, we need to change some things up here, because obviously the way the model is right now, projects are going over time, over budget, and the regulations are pretty challenging to actually build these large-scale reactors. Why not just take that problem head on instead of just saying, oh, yeah, you're right, it's going in the SMR direction?
I mean, people are doing that, right? And I am not a US regulatory lawyer. So when I moved to the States from Dubai, I joined a law firm that has Pillsbury, Winthrop, Shaw Pittman, that has a large nuclear practice, and a good portion of that practice is US regulatory. And these people are the experts, and these people know, the regulatory regime here in the United States so well. So they're the people to chat to about, US nuclear regulation and talking to the NRC. But of course, the technology vendors are also having those discussions. So, NuScale is having that discussion with the NRC right now, and they're going through that licensing process together right now.
So there are actually different types of lawyers for the different types
yes.
of nuclear? Can you walk me through some of those?
Yeah, sure. So you would think that nuclear law is already quite a small niche area.
Right.
But no, I mean, so in the US, with the number of plants that you have had here for so many years, there are a number of firms, not too many, but a few firms that have developed nuclear practices, and their practices mainly developed to support the US nuclear industry. And most of that work, of course, there was some new construction and some decommissioning work has started, and life extensions, but most of that work has focused on the day-to-day regulation of these plants. And that is what a number of the lawyers here in the US, that's what they focus on. And interactions with the NRC, internal management of what's going on at the plant, and making sure that safety standards are being followed and the safety culture is there, and how do you facilitate that from a legal and regulatory perspective and internal compliance perspective, etc. So that's something that a lot of lawyers here do. My background is development and a little bit of finance. So I am a construction and joint venture and pulling the actual project together type lawyer. So I'm not a regulatory lawyer. But as you said, part of the work that I have done and that I really enjoy is the broader picture of how does a country develop a nuclear program from scratch, and of course that involves setting up the legal and regulatory infrastructure, which is the laws and the regulations that we've been talking about.
Yeah. And the second part of what you had mentioned are sort of the challenging parts of developing a program from scratch is thinking about sort of the liability of a plant. So what do you mean when you say liability, and how can, I guess, countries reduce those issues?
Yeah, great question. So and I know you've had some lawyers on before who've touched a little bit on nuclear liability and certainly how it works here in the United States. But okay, so to talk about nuclear liability, we really need to, unfortunately, think about a situation like Fukushima, or even an accident that caused more transboundary damage than Fukushima. And the reason that we need to do this is because the liability issues focus on two things. They focus on ensuring that if there is a nuclear accident, that there is compensation available in a swift and as straightforward manner as possible for victims. The other thing it's trying to do is to manage what would otherwise be an unquantifiable, totally unknown, potentially unlimited liability that commercial companies involved in the nuclear sector would essentially carry with them through their involvement in any nuclear project. And from the very start of the nuclear industry, it was realised that these two factors needed to be considered, and they actually warranted a special legal regime. And that special legal regime exists in national laws of all of the countries that have nuclear power plants. And it was also realised that, of course, if an accident does happen in one country, it has the ability to cause transboundary damage or damage outside of that country.
And so this
in a neighbouring country or a proximate country.
Yeah.
And the way that the whole nuclear liability regime really works is that it seeks to make what would be an extraordinarily complicated litigation scenario potentially all over the world. It attempts to actually take that away by making one entity liable and one entity only liable so that you know who to bring your claim against, and that entity is exclusively and strictly liable. So you need to prove your damage and you need to prove some causation to the nuclear accident, but you don't have to prove, was it the fuel, was it a design fault, was it, you don't have to actually demonstrate who was at fault. The operator is liable to pay the third-party victims compensation.
So is it usually the operator of the power plant that is liable?
It's the licensed operator of the nuclear
power plant. Like the one individual or the multiple
not the individual person, the actual company that holds the operating license for the nuclear facility.
So then I would think that would really disincentivize a lot of people from nuclear because nobody wants all that responsibility.
Okay, so the framework isn't quite that simple. So, it can actually work in the operator's favour. So first it's very complicated and there's lots of other sort of principles that go into this regime. But the operator's liability has to be set at a minimum level. So, governments, if you've agreed to a treaty, the treaty sets what the minimum amount of available compensation must be. And as an operator, you have to have insurance or other coverage to ensure that that money is available in the event that there is a nuclear accident. But that operator's liability can be, in some countries, and it is in some countries, capped. So you say, yes, the operator is liable, and that may disincentivize operators from operating nuclear plants, but in some countries, their liability is actually limited. So they know going into it the maximum liability. Now, the other issue is, of course, there is other state funds that might be available, and to support the operator's liability if the operator's funds are exhausted, as we saw, and there's a practical solution as we saw in Japan from Fukushima. But this is really the getting into the issue here. But then when you talk about the international treaties and conventions that apply, the operator essentially gets even more protection because the operator cannot be sued in another country that is a contracting party to the same treaty or convention.
Interesting.
Because all claims relating to a certain nuclear accident must be brought in the country in which the accident occurred. And so it may sound like the operator is actually getting the really bad deal here, but they are able to manage their risk, understand quantify their liability, get insurance for that liability, and then if the country that they're operating in is a signatory or a contracting party to an international treaty regime, they can't be sued in those other countries that are also contracting parties. So, we're attempting to balance a number of different competing interests here.
Right.
And this is the way we've come up with to do it.
Yeah, and I think it's hard because it's all about money because you need to get your nuclear plant profitable at some point, but then I'm sure you have to have this huge sum of money. Like on average, do you have like a number of how much the liability cost is?
Yeah, so not the liability cost, but the minimum amount of liability that a plant must have under the new conventions. The CSC, for example, the Convention on Supplementary Compensation, and the 97 Vienna Convention is 300 million SDRs, special drawing rights of the IMF, which is about $430 approximately $1 million. They need to have insurance. That doesn't mean they need to have it sitting in their bank account.
Right.
They need to be able to pay that. And there are insurance pools that have been established so they can go and buy the insurance policy and then they are covered in the event of an accident.
And how does this liability scenario compare to other industries or say coal and natural gas plants? Do they have a similar legal framework and a similar, cost or similar liability base number? So
I can't talk to the oil and gas industry. I can't, but I can say that I did some interesting work a couple of years ago now, where we were looking at other types of transboundary damage potentially, and one of them was oil spills. And I discovered that there is an international legal regime that is actually quite similar to the nuclear liability regime for the nuclear sector, which says if there is a large spill, this entity is liable, and it attempts to deal with these transboundary issues of very complicated liability issues, very complicated litigation issues in a more simplified way. So there are other regimes out there that are similar to the nuclear liability regime and that apply in similar contexts and for similar types of potential accidents.
And so going back to, how we got into this conversation, you starting Bahrain's, did I say that right? Bahrain's nuclear industry, essentially.
Well,
what is it like now?
So I can't say that I established Bahrain's nuclear industry because Bahrain actually stopped its nuclear program after 2011. Yeah, so, and I actually left the firm I was at and the region around that time, a few months after the Fukushima accident. But, there are a number of factors why Bahrain hasn't gone ahead today, and maybe in the future it might consider some technologies that might be more suited to a small island nation like SMRs in the future.
Yeah, so was it then the biggest issue was just the large plants?
Well, they hadn't even gotten into, by the time I left, the siting study. So they were thinking about doing a siting study to see, does Bahrain on any of its islands actually have land where they could site a large unit? And they were just going down that path of starting those inquiries.
Interesting.
When I left.
Yeah.
And
then where'd you go?
They stopped the program. I moved here to DC to join Pillsbury and worked in their nuclear practice for 4 years, which was fantastic. And I got to work with some of the real titans of the nuclear industry, folks like Jay Silberg and Jim Glasgow, who I just admire so much. So I did that for 4 years, and I was focused again because Pillsbury has their domestic regulatory practice. I was focused on the international side of Pillsbury's business, and had a lot of fun doing that. And then eventually, after 4 years, I was recruited to another firm with the partner I still work with, George Barovas. He and I moved to join Sherman & Sterling's nuclear practice to sort of facilitate the development of their practice. And for the last 4 years, for the previous 4 years, I did that, and I've been flying solo now for a year.
Yeah, so you wrote a book and you made your own company. So what was the motivation behind those two? Okay, so let's start with the book. Actually, the first edition of the book came out in 2013. And what's the book's name? It's called The Law of Nuclear Energy. Okay. So a rather ambitious title. And again, it was my my former boss, Joe Hughes at Freshfields when I was living in the Middle East, who, he saw that I immediately fell in love with nuclear law as a area of law to practice in. And, so I said, Joe, we have to establish a nuclear practice at Freshfields, and, we've got to do it like this and see these companies and go to these conferences and do this stuff. And I also had all this work to do. And at one point he said to me, I think you should write a textbook. And I said, well, you've said some pretty ludicrous things, Joe, but this might be the most ludicrous, because what do I know about this subject? I was like 2 years into learning about it. Right. The idea of writing a textbook, like, it was ridiculous. And he said, no. He said, when you first got into this, you came into my office over and over again and you said, there is not a textbook that I can buy, and I am so frustrated. You can't buy the EPC contracts textbook, you can't buy the contracts law textbook, you can't buy the torts law textbook. For nuclear, it didn't exist. And you could buy, a textbook on the UK's legal regime. You could go into the IAEA and get all their fantastic resources. You could take a look at all of the international treaties and conventions and try and piece it all together. But there wasn't a single textbook. And so he said to me, I think you should write the textbook that would have been useful to you when you first started out. Why not? Right.
And so I said, okay, sure, I'll do this. 3 years later, and more weekends than I care to remember later, I did publish the first edition of the book.
Amazing.
And it's so it's in 3 parts. The first part is on developing a nuclear program, international treaties and conventions, drafting a national nuclear law, nuclear regulation at a really, really high level with a focus on licensing and new build. And then the second part of the book is procurement, construction, financing, a chapter on the fuel cycle. And then the final part of the book is a chapter on SMRs and a chapter on the future of nuclear law. And so the first edition was published, and I really, to be honest, I felt really nervous and really uncomfortable that it was out there. And
why?
People would say, what did she know? Like, she's such a junior lawyer. She hasn't practiced in the industry for 50 years. And what right does she have to write this textbook? And so, honestly, I was so exhausted once I finally saw it, opened up the box and saw these textbooks. And I was so nervous that I just sort of put it aside and thought, oh, I'm glad that's done and I don't want to see it again. Yeah. And, please let nobody buy it, let no one read it. The feedback I got was not terrible. People did buy
it. It was amazing.
People did read it. I think people still thought it was quite ambitious of me to have done it. But anyway, the second edition was published last year.
Congrats.
And thank you. And so the publisher got in touch and about 3 years after it was released and said, oh, it's time for a second edition. And I said, oh, really? People have actually bought it? Then you actually want to do a second edition? They said, yeah. So I did do the second edition, and I feel more confident now after a decade of working in the industry, learning the industry, realising what's not out there, and that the ideas that I came up with to fill that gap in the textbook, they are actually, they're actually okay. I think they're valid. I'm going with them.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I was encouraged this time to structure the book a little bit differently. So I start with a chapter on nuclear law for policymakers, or not nuclear law, sorry, nuclear energy for policymakers.
Okay, so like an overview of what it actually is?
Yeah, an overview of what it is, and an overview, because the book is targeted really for people who were like me. They're getting into nuclear for the first time, governments that are thinking about nuclear for the first time. It was pointed out to me by my partner that the book was lacking a discussion of nuclear energy policy. Why do we do it? What are the benefits? What are the challenges if we do go down this path? And so I decided that, I'd write an introductory chapter on nuclear energy for policymakers. I'm sure my personal bias comes through, although I tried to make it a fair discussion of the pros and cons of benefits and challenges. And then I actually wrote a whole chapter this time on nuclear liability. So instead of having it sort of split through the international law and the national law, I extracted it into its own chapter. And then I've done a separate chapter on the front end of the fuel cycle and the back end of the fuel cycle, updated everything, including the SMR chapter, which of course the SMR market changes rapidly. So that needed some substantial updating, and then an update to the future of nuclear law chapter. So.
Well, that must have been pretty encouraging that after a couple of years you had so much to update, because it does mean that the industry is moving forward and you're learning even more than you knew then.
Absolutely. And there were really important things that had happened, like the Convention on Supplementary Compensation had come into force in the nuclear liability space. So it's one of the nuclear liability treaties that wasn't in force at the time of Fukushima, and is actually in force today because Japan signed on, and Japan's becoming a contracting party triggered the entry into force of the treaty, because there was enough megawatt plants. Like you had to have X number of countries plus this many plants essentially covered by the treaty before it actually came into force, and signatory by the US becoming a contracting party alone, because the US is the champion of this particular convention, wasn't enough to trigger entry into force. It needed other countries with significant nuclear programs. So that was one area which needed updating. And also the other big development in the international space was the entry into force of the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials Amendment. So the amendment to that convention had been around for a while, and the Obama administration actually gave it a push to get that treaty in force, and it entered into force also in that window between the first edition and the second edition.
And so you were writing this book while you were working here in the US.
Yes.
When did you decide to sort of break off from working for other firms and make your own firm?
Yeah, a year ago, just over a year ago now, I decided that I wanted to try something different. And really the reason for that, I think, is just my passion for doing the work that I love doing. And I had an amazing 15 years working at large law firms. But to do work in the nuclear sector, I think requires a single-minded focus. And I had said from day one when I first discovered nuclear law that I wanted to be a nuclear energy lawyer and I wanted to focus on this. And so my goal here is to set up a nuclear practice, maybe a nuclear law firm, that is dedicated to the sector. So with my new role, I still have a very strong relationship with my former law firm, Sherman & Sterling, and I still contract to them and support them in their nuclear work, and that's great. But I also get to pursue the work that I really enjoy and that I don't think is quite fitted to a large law firm's model. And I'll give you an example. I support the work of the International Atomic Energy Agency's Nuclear Infrastructure Department. I know you've interviewed Milko Kovachev, so his department, he and his team kindly often ask me to support their expert missions or workshops in countries that are newcomer countries and developing their infrastructure. And I often go as the law expert to these countries and have a great time with the IAEA, chatting about what other countries are doing and case studies and different options and things we've learned. And what I realised in doing this is that the IAEA is an amazing organisation, and they have some just excellent human resources, and they have an amazing wealth of materials and guidance, particularly for newcomer countries. But at the end of the day, they are an international organisation and they're restricted in what they can and can't do. So they can disseminate information, they can run workshops, but what they can't do is give strategic advice. They can't suggest which technology might be best for this country. They can't say, if you're negotiating against the Russian nuclear industry, these are the 5 things you need to be on the lookout for. If you're negotiating against the US industry, here are the 5 things that you need to think about. They can't give that advice.
Right.
But at the same time, these countries, they're still in the consideration phase. They're still in the development phase. They're not ready to hire the large international law firm to come in and do, all of this potential work. And so I see what I hope will be my role as sort of getting there in the middle and helping with that transition. So filling the gap between what the IAEA can do and sort of shepherding a program through with strategic, broad thinking, bringing all that knowledge that I've accumulated together to help structure a program. And then at the end of the day, of course, they will probably need to hire the big law firm, and that will happen.
Yeah, no, that's amazing that you identified that gap and are able to fill the role, because otherwise I think that countries are stuck in limbo.
Yeah, there is a little bit of an issue that they just can't get that strategic advice that they need. And there are a few people who have chosen to do a similar thing to what I'm doing, and we can also team together and help out as well. And then the other thing that I've really enjoyed the flexibility, I guess, to do is to think about nuclear education. Nuclear legal education, because there's not that much of it out there that's available. And in my new role, I have the flexibility to decide that if a country would like me to go and do a 2-day, 3-day workshop on subject that's of interest to them, I can do that.
Yeah.
And, it doesn't it does affect the billable hour concept, but, it's not something, I've got to do, so I'm going to have 3 days doing no work. So that means, what am I going to do for my billables? I don't, that's my decision now. And as I said, I want to do the work that I love, and I love this. So
yeah, it's amazing. And so you've been traveling a lot. What are some of the projects that you're working on in the countries that you're working with?
Yeah, so as we were discussing before, I travel all the time. And the country and the program that I've worked on intensively for the last 3.5 years is actually advising the Egyptian government on its nuclear program quite broadly, and then specifically on the negotiation of their project agreements with the Russian nuclear industry. So when I say intensively, I've spent, upwards of 80 to 100 days on the ground in Egypt each year over the last 3.5 years. And it has just been both a tremendous sort of personal sacrifice of time, not only the travel time out there, but also the time on the ground away from, family and friends. But what a learning experience, because it's all very well and good to, write a textbook and, read a textbook. But at the end of the day, you learn through doing it, and having the experience of negotiating these contracts opposite the Russians, and now to be seeing them implemented, it's just it's so valuable, and it was so interesting, and I loved it, and I still love it.
Yeah. So what is the nuclear scene in Egypt, and what are these relationships with Russia?
Yeah, so they've had a program since the 1950s. 1955, I think, is the date they say their program started. And over the years, they have contemplated launching a tender process a number of times for a large reactor. And for multiple reasons, some political, it just didn't happen. And then the program was reinvigorated a few years ago, and they were in discussions with vendors. And my understanding is at some point, the Russian nuclear industry and the Russian government in particular came in with, and they're one and the same. The Russian nuclear industry is obviously Russian state-owned. They came in with a comprehensive package and proposal, which started off in the form of an intergovernmental agreement. So there is an intergovernmental agreement that was signed at the end of 2015 between the government of Egypt and the government of Russia, which sets out the framework for, and it's the legal framework, the financial framework, the technical framework, the commercial framework for a project to build 4 VVER 1200 reactors.
And what's a VVER?
In Egypt, it's 1200. The Russian design, the current Russian design. So to build 4 of those units in Egypt on the Mediterranean coast. And as part of that deal, there is not only the construction contract, there is a nuclear fuel supply contract, which I actually was the lead negotiator of, and it is public that it is a long-term, so it's actually for the operating life of the units.
Wow.
Contract. So it's a
so that's like
very
what,
long-term,
like 50 or 60 years?
60 plus year contract, for fuel supply, which raised a number of interesting issues around energy security and security of supply, etc. So that was a really interesting contract to negotiate. There's also a spent fuel treatment contract and an operations support and maintenance contract. And there is also a rather sizable loan coming from the government of Russia to the government of Egypt. And it is, again, it's public that loan is valued at $25 billion to facilitate the project. So when you put that package together, it's I can absolutely understand it being attractive to Egypt. And they decided to go with this, and they've concluded those agreements, and those agreements actually became effective in December 2017. So we're into implementation now.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so it became attractive to Egypt in the sense that they have more financial support and they have to do less logistics on their side in terms of like, how are we going to get fuel and like a constant supply of fuel? Because it seems sort of like there's huge risk in relying on another country for a lot of your supplies, and it might just be more of a payoff to develop the industry so much in your country that eventually one day you could be a supplier as well.
It's certainly, you're absolutely right. There are risks involved in partnering with another country and becoming dependent on them. And as an energy security issue, that is one that a lot of countries, including in Europe, which are also quite reliant on Russian design and Russian fuel, have grappled with over the years. But at the end of the day, this package for Egypt was chosen as the best solution right now for Egypt to establish its industry. And hopefully we put in protections into these contracts so that if something happened and, there was a political issue between the two countries, we've thought about how to deal with these issues and what protections Egypt has in those scenarios. So you build that you build the exact issue that you have just raised about being reliant and being dependent on another country into your commercial contracts as best as you can.
So when you have to think about the legal protections, do you guys sort of rely, I guess, would it be mostly financial based? Because you said you do work a lot in finance. So is that sort of where the finance comes into play? Or are the legal, what do you mean when you say legal protections?
So you mentioned that, Egypt would be reliant on Russia. And so in my mind, I'm thinking about, so what if there is an issue between Egypt and Russia? Not saying that there will be, but what if there is? And you think about sort of the worst case scenarios in any project that you're working on. What if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens? And then what you do is you try and actually draft your commercial contracts so that this risk has been thought about, it's been identified, and there is a solution that has been negotiated between the two parties to deal with the consequences. So you're essentially trying to allocate this risk to one party or the other, and you're trying to also incentivize parties to continue to perform in certain scenarios. Now, there might be scenarios in which they can't, but, you try and think of them as well.
And when you are negotiating between the two parties, is this like the company in Egypt versus the main company in Russia, or is it like the governments negotiating, or both?
That's a really good question, Naomi. And I think, so it's sort of all of the above. And that's the interesting part about the Russian model. So it's government to government at first. The government owns the Russian nuclear industry through Rosatom. Rosatom has, owns all the subsidiaries, or most of them, or at least has a majority stake in them. And it's through those subsidiaries that the commercial agreements are actually put in place. So, you might sign an intergovernmental agreement with the Russian government. You might then sign individual contracts, like happened in Egypt, with the individual companies within the Russian apparatus who actually do this. So, for example, the fuel contract is with Tavel, the manufacturer of fuel in Russia. The construction contract is with Atomstroyexport. So,
it's a lot of different parties.
You end up negotiating with different commercial entities. But at the end of the day, what impresses me about the Russian industry is that it really is all one industry. And so you're negotiating against Atomstroyexport, but, there's probably someone from Rosatom overseas in the room. They're probably very coordinated. They know what's going on. And that was actually a very impressive thing about negotiating opposite the Russian industry, how they manage this massive industry with different companies, but how at the end of the day they're able to bring everything together. Yeah.
It's amazing. You've had such an amazing career in nuclear. And earlier you slightly mentioned that part of that seems to be because of nuclear's role in climate change. But what grabbed your attention in terms of nuclear law and made you want to keep pushing for nuclear energy?
Yeah. So I think I think to dedicate yourself to an industry, you have to believe in the industry. And I do believe that there should be, and I hope there will be, a future for nuclear energy in the world. Maybe not all countries, maybe some countries more than others, but I think nuclear, if you believe in climate change, nuclear definitely has a role to play, and I want to see that. But personally, and I guess selfishly, what interests me about nuclear law and what grabbed me from day one as, I really want to keep practicing in this sector is that there is so much left to do, and there isn't necessarily now there is a textbook that gives you some answers, but there isn't always the answer. The deal that was done before, you probably can't just copy it over and do that same deal again. You get to draft things, create things that not from scratch, because you don't normally create anything from scratch in the legal world anyway. You're looking for inspiration everywhere and precedents, but you have the ability, and in fact, it's not even you have it. It is demanded of you that you actually switch your brain on and rise to the intellectual challenge of identifying these new issues and coming up with ways to solve them. And I think that there is so much work to be done if nuclear energy is going to continue to supply clean energy for us. There is so much more that we can do. There is so much work to be done, and we all have to think and actively think about how we can continue to do it better, more efficiently, more effectively, safer, more secure, abiding by all the non-proliferation norms. There's so much to do in this sector, and that's what inspires me about it.
Yeah. And as we wrap up, what should we do next, and what's the future of nuclear look like?
Oh, goodness. Actually, I know you like to end with this question. I was actually hoping you might not ask it of me. Look, I'm a positive person, Naomi, and I hope I am. And I want to see, as I said, I want to see nuclear energy in there. I think we are at a bit of a crossroads globally. Will this industry go forward? And if it does, what does that look like? Are we going to build new large reactors? Is the time for large over and we're going to go into small? And if we're going to go into small, again, I really want them to succeed. I want to see it done, but I want to see it done right. I don't want to see a next wave of construction, particularly for the new technologies that are not on time and not on budget. And, there's regulatory delays, and if that happens, then I'm quite concerned about the future of nuclear. So I think we need, as an industry, and we are doing it, and there are many, many people who are far more intelligent and experienced than me who are dealing with these issues right now, but we really need to get out in front of them from a legal and regulatory perspective and make sure that the laws and the regulations that are meant to ensure the peaceful and safe use of nuclear energy don't become an impediment to that technology and to the deployment of that technology, not just in countries that have it today, but in particular in countries that would like it in the future.
Absolutely. Helen Cook, thank you so much.
Thank you, Naomi.